Amin. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
Kshetragya
Kshetragya
Atma
Atma
Purusha
Purusha
Purana.
Purana.
Kshetragya Atma Purusha Purana.
Kshetragya Atma Purusha Purana.
Kshetragya Atma Purusha Purana.
Kshetragya Atma Purusha Purana.
Sakshat
Sakshat
Swayam
Swayam
Jyoti
Jyotir
Aja
Aja
Parisha.
Paresha.
Sakshat Swayam Jyoti Raja Parisha.
Sakshat Swayam Jyoti Rajah Pareshah.
Sakshat Swayam Jyoti Raja Parisha.
Sakshat Swayam Jyoti Rajah Pareshah.
Kshetraga Atma Purusha Purana.
Kshetragya Atma Purushah Puranaha.
Sakshat Swayam Jyoti Raja Parisha.
Sakshat Swayam Jyoti Rajah Pareshah.
Narayano
Narayano
Bhagavan
Bhagavan
Vasudeva.
Vasudevaha.
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudeva.
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudevaha.
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudeva.
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudevaha.
Swamaya Yatman Yavad Swamaya Atmani
Swamayaya Atmanya
Avadityamana
Avadhiyamanaha.
Swamaya Yatman Yavidiyamana
Swamayaya Atmanya Vadhiyamanaha.
Maya Yatman Yavidiyamana
Swamayaya Atmanya Vadhiyamanaha.
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudeva
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudevaha.
Maya Yatman Yavidiyamana
Swamayaya Atmanya Vadhiyamanaha.
Tanila
Yatha Nilaha
Tavara
Sthavara
Jangamanam
Jangamanam.
Yatanila Stavara Jangamanam
Yatha Nilaha Sthavara Jangamanam.
Yatanila Stavara Jangamanam
Yatha Nilaha Sthavara Jangamanam.
Atma
Atma
Sarupena
Swarupena
Nivishta
Nivishta
Ishet
Ishet.
Atma Sarupena Nivishta Ishet
Atma Swarupena Nivishta Ishet.
Atma Sarupena Nivishta Ishet
Atma Swarupena Nivishta Ishet.
Yatanila Stavara Jangamanam
Yatha Nilaha Sthavara Jangamanam.
Atma Sarupena Nivishta Ishet
Atma Swarupena Nivishta Ishet.
Evam
Evam
Paro
Paro
Bhagavan
Bhagavan
Vasudeva
Vasudevaha.
Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudeva
Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudevaha.
Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudeva
Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudevaha.
Kshetragya
Kshetragya
Atmedam
Atmedam
Anupravishta
Anupravishtaha.
Kshetraga Atmedam Anupravishta
Kshetrajna Atmedam Anupravishtaha.
Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudeva
Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudevaha.
Kshetragya Atmedam Anupravishta
Kshetrajna Atmedam Anupravishtaha.
Kshetraga Atma Purusha Purana
Kshetrajna Atma Purusha Puranaha.
Sakshat Swayam Jyoti Raja Paresha
Sakshat Swayam Jyotirajah Pareshah.
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudeva.
Narayano Bhagavan Vasudevah.
Maya Yatmanya Vidiyamana.
Somayayatmanya Vadhiyamanah.
Anila Stavara Jangamanam.
Yatha Nilhasthavara Jangamanam.
Atmasrupena Nivishta Ishet.
Atmasvarupena Nivishta Ishet.
Evamparo Bhagavan Vasudeva.
Evam Paro Bhagavan Vasudevah.
Chetraga Atmedamanu Pravishta.
Kshetrajna Atmedam Anupravishtaha.
Someone else like to chant?
Anyone wants to chant?
Okay, Chetraga,
Kshetrajna,
Supreme Personality of Godhead.
the Supreme Personality of Godhead.
Atma,
Atma,
all pervading,
all pervading,
present everywhere.
present everywhere.
Purusha,
Purushaha,
the unrestricted controller
the unrestricted controller
who has unlimited power.
who has unlimited power.
Purana,
Puranaha,
original.
the original.
Sakshad,
Sakshat,
perceivable by hearing from authorities
perceivable by hearing from the authorities
and by direct perception.
and by direct perception.
This is a really interesting translation that Srila Prabhupada is giving here. That is perceivable by hearing from authorities. So there's two very prominent points that Prabhupada is making here. Any thoughts on what those points are? No? Well, the first point that's there from that word is that he's saying that you can understand Krishna through the process of hearing. And there's a nice verse, Rupa Goswami quotes, Satasri Krishna Namadi Navavidrayam Indraya Sevan Mukhi Jivaro Swayameva Spratyataha, that it's not possible to understand that the name, form, quality, and pastimes of the Lord through material contaminated senses. But when the senses become purified through the devotional process, and he says that this devotional process begins with the tongue. And the tongue is business is to vibrate and to eat. So when by vibrating and also by hearing, then the heart becomes purified, and one can actually begin to perceive the Supreme Person of Godhead. And then also Prabhupada says from authorities. So it's not that we just hear from anyone. And this is a really important point, is that some people are of the view that it doesn't matter where you hear something from, as long as you're hearing it, that's okay. But what happens is if the personality is not pure in heart, then whatever contamination they experience, then what they're speaking is flavored by that contamination. There's an interesting point Prabhupada makes in when he gives the purport of the Hare Krishna mantra in that album that he produced early on in the 60s, where he said that the chanting of Hare Krishna must be heard from the lips of the pure devotee. Otherwise, and he gives the example of when milk is touched by the lips of a serpent, it produces a poison effect. So in the same way, if we hear Hare Krishna from a non-devotee, it will actually have the opposite effect of what it's meant to have. So very, very important points that Prabhupada is making here. Swayam,
Swayam,
personal.
personal.
Jyoti,
Jyotihi,
manifesting his bodily rays.
manifesting his bodily rays.
Brahman effulgence.
Brahman effulgence.
Aja,
Ajaha,
never born.
never born.
Haresha,
Pareshaha,
Supreme Personality of Godhead.
the Supreme Personality of Godhead.
Narayana,
Narayanaha,
resting place of all living entities.
the resting place of all living entities.
So this ayana means like resting, and nara, just like we have shayan, the shayan, they lie down. So ayana means resting, nara means living entities. So he's the resting place of all living entities. Bhagavan,
Bhagavan,
the personality of Godhead with 6 full opulences.
the personality of Godhead with 6 full opulences.
Vasudeva,
Vasudevaha,
shelter of everything.
the shelter of everything,
manifested and non-manifested.
manifested and non-manifested.
So it's interesting here also, we see that the personality of Godhead is being addressed in many different ways. You see, it's like, okay, so Chetrik Yah, he's the one who sees the field, he's the knower of the field. He's Atma, he's all pervading, he's present everywhere. Purusha, he's the unrestricted controller. Purana, he's the original. Sakshat, you can directly perceive him. And then he talks about Jyoti, he manifests his bodily rays. Ajah, he's never born. Parasha, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Narayana, the resting place of all living entities. Bhagavan, the Personality of Godhead, full of six opulence. And Vasudeva, the shelter of everything. Just so we're clear who's being referred to here. We see that Rahugana, just so Judd Bharat is addressing Rahugana here. Just so Rahugana is in no doubt, because up until this section of this verse, we see that Judd Bharat has been describing the conditioned living entity. And he's also said, I think in the first or the second verse, I think it was the first verse where he said to Rahugana that, the way you're talking, you don't understand anything. You're bewildered. And just so that Maharaj Rahugana doesn't get confused about who he's talking about, because oftentimes we see that people will think that the jiva possesses all these, the conditioned jiva possesses all these qualities. He wants to make sure that Maharaj Rahugana understands he's talking about the Supreme Personality of Godhead, so he's addressing him in all these different ways. So it's very clear. And we see this is a common thing throughout the Bhagavatam in the scriptures, is when someone is speaking the absolute truth and they're speaking about the absolute truth, they will very clearly identify who it is, just so the audience has no doubt who he's talking about. Swamayaya,
Somaya,
by his own potency.
by his own potency.
Atmani,
Atmani,
in his own self,
in his own self,
or in the ordinary living entities.
or in the ordinary living entities.
Avadiyamana,
Avadhiyamanaha,
existing as the controller.
existing as the controller.
Yata,
Yatha,
as much as.
much as.
Nila,
Anilaha,
the air.
the air.
Stavara,
Sthavara,
of non-moving living entities.
of non-moving living entities.
Jangamanam,
Jangamanam,
and of the moving living entities.
and of the moving living entities.
Atma Sarupena,
Atma Swarupena,
by his expansion as the super soul.
by his expansion as the super soul.
Nivishta,
Nimishtaha,
entered.
entered.
Ishet,
Ishet,
controls.
controls.
Evam,
Evam,
thus.
thus.
Para,
Para,
transcendental.
transcendental.
Bhagavan,
Bhagavan,
Supreme Personality of Godhead.
the Supreme Personality of Godhead.
Vasudeva,
Vasudevaha,
shelter of everything.
the shelter of everything.
Kshetragya,
Kshetragya,
known as Kshetragya.
known as Kshetragya.
Atma,
Atma,
vital force.
the vital force.
Idam,
Idam,
this material world.
this material world.
Anupravishta,
Anupravishtaha,
entered within.
entered within.
Translation. There are two kinds of Kshetragya. The living entity, as explained above, and the Supreme Personality of Godhead, who is explained as follows. He is the all-pervading cause of creation. He is full in himself and is not dependent on others. He is perceived by hearing and direct perception. He is self-effulgent, and he does not experience birth, death, old age, or disease. He is the controller of all the demigods, beginning with Lord Brahma. He is called Narayana, and he is the shelter of all living entities. He's the shelter of living entities after the annihilation of this material world. He is full of all opulences, and he is the resting place of everything material. He is therefore known as Vasudeva, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. By his own potency, he is present within the hearts of all living entities, just as the air or vital force is within the bodies of all beings, moving and non-moving. In this way, he controls the body in his partial feature. The Supreme Personality of Godhead enters all bodies and controls them. So very clear statement here by Jad Bharat. And he starts off by explaining there are two types of knowers of the field, or the Chetra Gya. Chetra means field, Gya means to know. And this is referred to by Krishna in the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. Again, he talks about the same concepts, that the two knowers of the field, Chetra meaning field. The living entity. This is what's been referred to here previously as the living entity, and now Jad Bharat is going on to explain about the Supreme Person of Godhead, and he just wants to make it very clear to Maharaj Rahugana, because Jad Bharat is, if we remember the story here of Jad Bharat, Maharaj, because we started off with this chapter. Like, if you go back to the fourth canto, it talks about Manu, how Manu was Manu and what is his name, Shruti. Oh, I've forgotten his wife's name. But anyhow, Manu and his wife were created. Swayambhuva Manu and his wife were created from the body of Brahma, and then they had children, two prominent children. They had daughters, but also their two prominent children as they had was Priyavrata and Uttanapad. So in the fourth canto, it described Uttanapad and how Uttanapad had two sons. One was called Uttama, and the other was, does anyone remember the other son of Uttanapad? Very well-known son.
Dhruva.
Yeah, Dhruva Maharaj, very, very famous personality. And actually, Dhruva Maharaj was a very, very elevated devotee. And you read those purports in the fourth canto, and Srila Prabhupada was very, very, very much glorifying Dhruva Maharaj as a great saintly personality. And we can see, he was receiving direct instructions from Narad Muni, and Prabhupada, one of the purports, calls him the foremost Vaishnava. So we can see how he was a greatly elevated soul. It's so great that actually Narad Muni had come down to instruct him directly, and then by following Narad Muni's instructions, then the Supreme Personality of Godhead himself manifested before Dhruva Maharaj. So the fourth canto is describing him, his descendants, etc. Then we go on to the fifth canto, and we see in the beginning it starts talking about the activities of the other son of Swayambhuva Manu, who was Priyavrata Maharaj, and then also his son Agnidra, who was more prominent. He had a few prominent sons, Kavi also, and you'll see different personalities are mentioned throughout the Bhagavatam and the Puranas. But primarily it talks about Agnidra, and then from Agnidra he had a number of sons, one of which who was Bharat. And Bharat Maharaj, we understand, he was the emperor of the world, and how he had at one point gave up his kingdom, which is really interesting, because we see with the Kshatriyas of yore, they would rule the world for a certain period of time, and then they'd give everything up to give up the kingdom, incredible opulence, beautiful wives, and so much facility they had to enjoy life in the material world, but they gave it all up for the purpose of God realization, which is very different from what we see in this day and age. Like there's an election coming up in America soon, I think, and you'll see how both the personalities who are the candidates for from the different parties is they will fight tooth and nail to get the power, and that they want to hang on to the power forever. They don't want to ever let go of it. They want to hang on until they die. And even we see in some situations, people make arrangements so their children can also get the power, because it's an expansion of themselves, and the children expansion. So they see that if the child gets power, then my dynasty will be taken care of. They'll have wealth, they'll have fame, they'll have everything they need. And this is the material situation: is people just cling on to the power, till death. And we've seen this so many times. This has happened. Even Prabhupada would often talk about Mahatma Gandhi, and how saying, he wrote a letter not long before Gandhi was killed, and he wrote a letter to him and advising him to give up power and to focus on his spiritual practice. Yet he didn't, and he was, he clung on to power, and he was shot and killed. And so we can see how, even these great so-called great personalities, they're so attached to the position of power, and they'll hang on to death. But here we see how Priyavrata was a good example, and also with Bharat Maharaj. He gave up his kingdom. He went to the forest to focus on his God consciousness. But unfortunately, due to inattention, he was distracted from that path, and he became attached to a little deer, and so much so that when he was giving up his body, he was worried about the deer. Where's the deer? How will the deer go on without me? The deer won't be able to survive without me taking care of it. Thinking that this concept of I'm the controller, I'm the enjoyer, I'm the doer in all activities. He became overwhelmed by this. And even though he was a great devotee of the Lord, he was actually, Prabhupada describes in the purports how he was on the level of bhava. And even though he's such an elevated devotee, because of inattention, he became distracted from the process of bhakti. So this is a good warning for us. And in the morning in the temple we chant the Nama Paraj often, and Bhaktivinoda Thakur in his commentaries on I think it's in the Harinam Chintamani, he mentions that all the offences in the holy name, in the chanting of the Hare Krishna Mahamantra, stem from inattention. So we need to be very, very attentive in the process of bhakti, and especially attentive in the chanting of Hare Krishna Mahamantra. And then so what happened is because of his attachment to the deer, and especially because he was thinking about it when he left his body, he became a deer in his next life. And then as a deer, he would shun, because by Krishna's arrangement, because it's unusual that a living entity will remember the past life. So by Krishna's arrangement, he remembered what had happened in his previous life, and he therefore did not associate with the deers. He was mostly concerned with trying to stay focused on his Krishna consciousness, because he didn't want to make the same mistake again. He realized that he'd been a fool, and that he'd allowed himself to become overly attached. I mean, attachment's not a bad thing if that attachment is focused on cultivating Krishna consciousness, if that attachment is focused on elevating the other living entity to the platform of Krishna consciousness. But he was just attached to the external body of the deer, and thinking that the deer was completely dependent upon him, and only by his potency could the deer survive. But actually, he'd forgotten that everything is going on by the mercy of Krishna. He'd forgotten that it was only by Krishna's arrangement that a living entity will live or die. There's a verse that sometimes is quoted where it mentions that only I can't remember the verse right now, but it mentions that if Krishna wants to save you, no one can kill you, and if Krishna wants to kill you, no one can save you. So he had forgotten this principle, that actually every living entity is existing by the mercy of Krishna. Every living entity is maintained by the mercy of Krishna. This whole material universe is coming about by Krishna's potency. And so if Krishna wants to save us, nobody can destroy us. And if Krishna wants to destroy us, nobody can save us. So he had forgotten this, and therefore he became bewildered about the actual situation. And therefore his reaction to that was that he had to take birth as a deer. And when he took birth as a deer, he wanted to make sure, because by Krishna's mercy, because he was a very advanced devotee, but by Krishna's mercy, he was able to remember his past life, and therefore said, okay, that was very foolish. I'm not going to do that again. And then when he finished his life as a deer, he took birth as Jad Bharat. And Jad Bharat was a very, very spiritually aware personality, very, very spiritually aware. And so even though in his family, his father tried to engage him in so many different activities, external activities and stuff, he just presented himself as being, stupid all the time, even though internally his focus was just on the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And so much so, like he would do all sorts of funny things, like he would wash his hands before going to the bathroom. His father, tried to give him Brahmin Diksha. He wore the Brahmin thread on the outside of his clothes. He did so many things that everyone just thought he was a fool. And he was okay with that, because that then meant that they weren't going to distract him from his internal meditation. But he was a very, very advanced soul. And so much so we see that when he came upon Rahugana, because Rahugana was a powerful personality, and at one point, that he was inducted to being Rahugana's palanquin carrier, but he was when he's carrying the palanquin, he wasn't carrying it in a good way because he didn't want to step on the ants and and other smaller living entities. And so at one point, Rahugana started to chastise him, and then Jad Bharat said, "Okay, this is a good opportunity. I will, explain Krishna consciousness to this personality." And we see that Rahugana, this will come, I think, in the next chapter. This chapter here is very short. There's only 17 verses, and we see in the next chapter how Rahugana, he gained realization through the instructions of the great personality. And this is the thing that's mentioned by Prabhupada in the verse here, is by hearing the transcendental messages from great personalities or from authorized personalities like Jad Bharat, one gains realization, one gains knowledge, one gains awareness of the actual situation in this material world. So we see how it's a wonderful story, and it's also very, very instructive for us, because we can see that even though we're practicing devotional service, we have to be very, very careful. Prabhupada would sometimes compare the process of bhakti to a razor's edge. And especially, like, you don't see them much these days, but I remember when I was a child, we would go to the barbers here in Australia. Well, actually, I'm not in Australia now. I'm in Fiji, in New Zealand. And so when I was a child in Melbourne, my father would take us to the barber, and they used to have this cutthroat razor, which was like just an open blade about this long, and they sharpen up on a leather strap and that. And they'd shave all around the back of your neck with this cutthroat razor. And my father, he'd get his face shaved with a cutthroat razor. And if the barber wasn't careful, sometimes he would nick the person they were shaving with the corner of the blade, and there'd be profuse blood. And so Prabhupada would sometimes say that the process of bhakti is sometimes it's like a razor, especially when we're not so advanced. For someone who's on the level of prema, then there's no question of having any difficulty or any deviation. But for someone, especially like myself, who's not very advanced in the process of bhakti, then we need to be very, very careful, because we can easily become distracted by things in this material world, and this distraction can take us away from the process of devotional service. And I'm sure we've all seen devotees who've come, they've practiced devotional service for some time, and they seem to be progressing very well and becoming very advanced. But then they fall away from the process of bhakti because they're not careful. They become distracted. And so this story is a very good lesson for us all to become very focused, very careful to ensure that we don't get distracted. All right, I'll read Prabhupada's purport. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita 15:15. Savasya ham hridisanavisto mata smriti ganam aponam cha. Every living being is controlled by the Supreme Living Being, Paramatma, who resides within everyone's heart. He is the Purusha avatar, who creates this material world. The first Purusha is Mahavishnu, and that Mahavishnu is a plenary portion of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. So we see that Krishna, he expands himself as Balaram, then Balaram expands himself as Sankarshan, and then Sankarshan Chatavyuha comes, and then we see that the Purusha avatars come from the second Chatavyuha. Krishna's first expansion is Baladev, and his next expansions are Vasudev, Sankarshan, Anirudh, and Pradyumna. Vasudev is the original cause of the Brahmajyoti, and the Brahmajyoti is the expansion of the rays of the body of Vasudev. Yasha Prabha Prabhavato Jagadanda Koti Kotish Vishesha Pasudari Vibhuti Binam Tad Brahma Nishklam Ananta Shesha Bhutam Govindam Adipurusham Tamaham Bhajami. I worship Govinda, the primeval Lord, who is endowed with great power. The glowing effulgence of his transcendental form is the impersonal Brahman, which is absolute, complete, and unlimited, and which displays the varieties of countless planets with their different opulences in millions and millions of universes. Brahma Samhita 540. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is thus described in Bhagavad Gita. Mayatatam idam sarvam jagadavyakta murtina matstani sarvabhutani na chaham teshvavastitaha. By me, in my unmanifested form, this entire universe is pervaded. All beings are in me, but I am not in them. This is the position of the plenary expansions of Krishna as the all-pervading Sankarshan, Vasudeva, Sankarshan, Pradyumna, and Aniruddha. So that's Prabhupada's purport. So, yeah, Prabhupada is explaining here because we see here in this verse how Jad Bharat is explaining to Rahugana the different nodes of the field. First off, he mentions the different nodes of the field, but then he focuses on explaining the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And then Prabhupada, in his purport, is explaining how, first off, he's saying how the Lord is situated in everyone's heart. He says, Savasha Chaham Hridi Sanavishna. Sanavishna means situated. Hridi means heart. And Aham means I, Cha, and Savasha, all. So he's situated in all the hearts of all living entities. And he says, Mata Smriti Gyam, from me come knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. So, if the living entity is inspired to, because Krishna is right there in the heart. So if the living entity wants to remember Krishna, then Krishna makes all facility, makes all arrangements. He provides, as it's mentioned in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, it says, Brahmanda Brahmatikona Bhagavan Ajiv, Guru Krishna Prasad Kripa Poi Bhakti Lata Beach. That, the living entities wandering throughout the countless universes, up and down throughout the universes. And if one's very fortunate, it's not just about fortune. It means if one has some piety. I mean, obviously, the piety relates to fortune. Then, by the mercy of Krishna, a fortunate living entity will get the opportunity to associate with a spiritual master or to come into contact with a spiritual master, and then through the instructions of that spiritual master, the living entity will come to understand Krishna. So this is the situation. Is Krishna makes the arrangement for the living entities to come back to him. Naturally, Krishna, as a loving father, he wants all his part and parcel jivas to come back to him, but they have to be willing in that approach. They have to be willing to return back to the spiritual world. But we see in this material world that most people are not willing. Most people want the exact opposite. They think this is the only place you can enjoy. They think they're having a great life, and they're thinking, that I want more and more of this. They don't realize that this material world is a place of suffering. Even though they do suffer at every minute of the day, practically. I was in Sydney recently. It was going out to a home program, and the car we were in, we pulled up behind this car. The whole back of the car was smashed in, and there was another car on the other side of the road. It obviously hit him and spun around. And the poor fellow who was driving this car, he got out of the car. He was in a state of shock. He was completely bewildered. The driver in the car thought he was intoxicated, but it didn't seem like that to me. It seemed like he was just in a state of shock, because obviously the back of his car had been hit very hard. And so much so that the whole boot was sort of level with the windscreen, the back window, and he just got out, and he didn't know what had happened. He didn't know who had hit him. He thought we had hit him, but he looked at the front of our car, and he saw there was no damage. He looked at the back of his car, and so the poor guy, he was just completely bewildered, just completely distressed, about what had happened, and so this is obviously a very graphic example, but we see that in so many situations how people are suffering, and the challenge is they're not aware of their suffering situation. They're thinking that I'm okay. There's an interesting book that was written by some fellow years ago called "I'm Okay, You're Okay," but the fact of it is the living entities are not okay because of this one essential point, is because of avidya. They're not aware of who they are. They think that they're the controller. They think they're the enjoyer. But the scriptures help us to understand our actual position. Jivera Swarupahoy Krishnera Nityadas, Krishnera Tasta Shakti, Beda Bed Prakash. That actually I'm not this material body, I'm Krishna's eternal servant. Jivera Swarupahoy Krishnera Nityadas. So it means I'm always a servant. Nitya means regularly, it also means always. So it means I'm always a servant of Krishna. It never changes no matter what body I take, whether I'm in a demigod body, a human body, an ant body, a microbe. It doesn't matter. I'm always a servant of Krishna. But the living entity has forgotten this because of this, because he's been put in this situation of forgetfulness by his desire. Krishna facilitates the desire. It's not that he wants us to do this, but because of our desire, we've wanted to forget Krishna because we think, well, if I forget Krishna, I can enjoy in this material world. And this is what I want to do. This is what I want to enjoy. And if I remember Krishna, I'll have to give up this enjoyment. So I don't want that. I want to forget Krishna because that way I can enjoy. But the foolish living entity doesn't realize that the only way to enjoy, because we have all these facilities here, but these facilities don't, the facilities of the body, the senses, the mind, etc. These facilities don't belong to us. These facilities belong to God. And forgetting this, the benefit of the facility is removed. But if we remember these things actually belong to Krishna, and we use these things to serve Krishna, I was listening to, that's right, this morning I was listening to Prabhupada was explaining, he says, Yasman Tusti Jagat Tustat, that when Krishna becomes satisfied, Tusti, when he's experiencing pleasure, Jagat Tustat, the whole universe experiences pleasure. This is the only way. It's just like, and also Prabhupada would give the analogy. It's like, you can take food and any of the senses can try to enjoy that food, like the sense of touch can try to enjoy the food by feeling the food. And you'll get some minor enjoyment, but you're not really going to enjoy it. You're not going to really get the benefit of the food. Or you can try and, look at it and get the benefit from that and try to nourish the body, but you won't get the nourishment you need. Or you can try to smell the food, and you'll get some pleasure, but it's very minimal. And of course, ears, they don't really hear food, but and if you try to put the food in the ear, it's not going to be very helpful for the body. But the point is like, if we take that nourishing food and insert it into the body in the proper way through the mouth, then all the senses will get the benefit of that. And the body will become nourished. So if we understand the process, if we understand how to nourish the body through the process of eating and what types of food are suitable to eat, then we'll get the maximum benefit. In the same way, if we understand that the real interest of the living entity, the real interest of the self, is in service of Krishna, and the way to nourish the self is through serving Krishna, then we can actually get the benefit of this human form of life. But if one's foolish, if one doesn't understand that the way to get the benefit of the human form of life is to serve Krishna, then actually they're not qualified to have a human form of life, and therefore it's taken from us. And you'll find that those who don't use this human form of life to serve Krishna are cast down into lower species such as animal species, plant species, etc. And they suffer in those conditions for many, many years. And you see, one time I remember I was in Brisbane Temple, and we were chanting japa in the morning, circumambulating Tulsi after Mangalati, and there was some sort of insect, I can't remember what it was walking across the floor. So I can't remember whether I picked it up. I think I picked it up, So, I was worried that the insect was going to get squashed. So I very carefully picked it up, a piece of paper, put it outside on the ground so it could go on with its existence without being squashed. And then a bird swooped down and ate it. So you can see how, this is the existence of all living in this material world is like this jivo jivasya jivanam, how one living entity is food for another. And the thing is, the living entities, they're all very fearful of this. They're fearful that they're going to get eaten. That at some point, I could be eaten by some other living entities. So they're always very carefully looking around, who's coming to attack me? Who's coming to eat me? Yeah. So this is the situation, and the same in the material world. Like in the work environment. I'm not sure if any of you experience this, but I know many devotees have shared with me how they experience in the work environment, especially in the corporate environment, how it's so competitive. And then if you get a good position, then others are envious and they want your position, and they try to manipulate and make politics against you to try and push you down and to push themselves up. And this is the nature of the material world. It's often described as a dog-eat-dog society, how one living entity is trying to lord it over the other and trying to take their position and take everything from them. Yet, most living entities, most people in this world, they think, well, that's just the way it is, and I just have to tolerate that. But a devotee has knowledge, a devotee has wisdom, a devotee understands that this is not my position. And this is where Rahugan is at, Jad Bharat's at. He's understanding this is not the position of the living entity, is to try to enjoy the material world. And he sees that Rahugana is thinking like the way he spoke to Jad Bharat in one of the previous verses. He's thinking, I think it was in the previous chapter, he's thinking that he's the controller, he's the enjoyer. I'm the king. You have to do things the way I say. You have to make my life pleasant, and don't rock the palanquin. And Jad Bharat, he first starts off by explaining to him that well, you're saying, I'm like this, like I'm stupid on this. And he said, but this all relates to the body, and the body may be fat, may be thin. It doesn't matter because I'm not the body. And so straight away, he's talking from the platform of self-realization. He understands who he is, understands this position of Jivera Sarupa Hoy, that I'm Krishna's eternal servant, and that it doesn't affect me. Huh? And so Rahugan is, and so then Bharat continues with the instruction as we see here. He's explained the position of the conditioned jiva and how they go through so much difficulty. They don't understand who they are, etc. And now he's explaining the position of the Supreme God. And then he'll go on to explain also about the situation where a liberated soul becomes completely absorbed in thoughts of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. He also mentions that the jivas, in I think verse 15, how the jiva will wander in samsara until he comes to the platform of self-realization. And this is the only way out of this material world. Sometimes people become really frustrated in the material world, so they commit suicide or whatever, thinking that this will solve their problems. But actually, they just take another body. They take birth as a ghost. They take birth in lower species. So it's not the solution. The only solution of the samsara, of the cycle of birth and death, is to take full shelter at the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. And this is why he's describing here the characteristics of the Lord. So Rahugana can understand who it is that Jad Bharat is suggesting he surrenders to. And that he can have confidence that, as we see in this verse, it's describing how, he's the cause of creation. He's full in himself. He's not dependent on others. If you look at every living entity in this material world, they're dependent upon others for everything. It's just like here we are in Wellington. We're dependent on people for water, for electricity, for food, for transport. We're fully dependent. Without, in a city like Auckland, if you just didn't take anything from anyone else, how could you function? Even your clothing you're wearing, you're dependent upon others for your clothing. Someone grows the fiber or whatever it is, someone weaves it, someone manufactures it, someone transports it to the shop, and the shop sells it. You're dependent on others for everything. But the only person who's not is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Krishna. He's not dependent upon others. And so, to try and give Rahugana an understanding of who it is that he's surrendering to, he goes through this explanation, and then again he just reinforces with him is don't take shelter of the mind because it's the cause of all tribulation. Conquer it, and the way we conquer the mind is by neglect, because the mind is constantly just going on with so much rubbish. It's just incredible the stuff the mind comes up with, but just ignore it. Just ignore the mind, and focus on the service of Guru and Gauranga, and this will help us to, or this will empower us to overcome the influence of the material mind, and ultimately propel us back to the lotus feet of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. All right, that's about it from my side. Any questions, comments at all?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, Dawa Pranams.
Questions?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Thank you very much for the class. Prabhuji, the question I had is right at the beginning, you mentioned that when we're listening, we must listen from a bona fide source, because anytime we don't, any desires or anything that they have.
You're questioning whether I'm a bona fide source
No,
or
not you. Not you at all,
Probably
Prabhuji.
not.
So, but
Probably
you've
not.
almost picked up on my question there. So for, say, devotees within our ISKCON movement and things like that, for new devotees like me who have been given the service to also preach, how does that apply to someone like me in terms of me as a preacher, and also for those listening to
Sure.
someone if I've been given that service?
Just like Prabhupada, he gives a very interesting example. He said, if the father tells the son, this is a microphone, yeah, and then someone asks the son, what's this? And he says, this is a microphone. He's authorized because he's just repeating. And that's the thing. As long as you repeat what you've heard from Prabhupada, from the previous acharyas, you're authorized. As soon as you start to make up your own idea, as soon as you start to present your own philosophy, and this is why it's really important to study Prabhupada's books, because if you don't study Prabhupada's books, you won't understand the philosophy. So you can easily become distracted or bewildered when someone else comes along who seems like an authority, who's presenting some nonsense. So we need to be very diligent in our study of Prabhupada's books. Try to study every day. I mean, I try to make a practice of reading at least 10 verses and purports a day. But not especially when I'm traveling or when I'm giving classes all day long, it's difficult to do that. But it's very important to become conversant with the philosophy, so that we're repeating. Because Prabhupada, sometimes people would say, "Oh, Swamiji, you've done miracles." He said, "But I have done no miracles. I have simply tried to repeat what my spiritual master said." So he's emphasizing the point of the parampara. He's emphasizing the point of being authorized, because if you follow the previous authority, then you're authorized. If you make up your own process, you're a nonsense. So don't manufacture philosophy. Just simply repeat that which has been given to us by our founder Acharya, and then you become authorized. And in that way, you become empowered, because through the parampara, you're connected to Krishna. Through the parampara, you're connected to Rupa Goswami, Jiva Goswami, Sanatana Goswami, all these great personalities. But if you make up your own idea, then it doesn't work. You may develop gather followers and stuff. If you're charismatic or whatever, you might gather some followers. But there's an interesting analogy given in the Bhagavatam. It's just like if it talks about the unbona fide guru, that it's just like going to sea on a lead boat. What happens if you set out to sea on a lead boat? You all get on the boat goes out, it sinks because it's lead. So that's the destination of nonsense guru and nonsense followers. And there's that Guru Pramatha is talked about in the I can't remember where it is, but yeah, it's an interesting story about Guru Pramatha. He was a nonsense guru with nonsense followers, and always it was a disaster. So as long as you follow, then you're authorized.
Thank you, Prabhuji. Very nice.
That's my only qualification, is because I tried, I listen to Prabhupada. I try to listen to Prabhupada every day. And what I learned from Prabhupada's lectures is just astounding. I listen to other Vaishnavas too, but my main focus is to listen to Prabhupada, because him, I'm sure, he's a pure alloyed devotee of Krishna. The others are definitely advanced devotees, more advanced than me, but I'm not convinced that they're pure unalloyed devotees of Krishna. But Prabhupada, I'm convinced. So, and you can just see his life, even the way his whole life, he was just a pure unalloyed devotee of Krishna. His passing, the way he passed, he was just completely absorbed in Krishna. There wasn't a point, he said, there wasn't a point where I ever forgot Krishna. And we can see that in his life. He was always remembering Krishna. He was always dedicated to spreading Krishna consciousness. So we have such a wonderful example there. Therefore, it behooves an intelligent person to follow his example, to listen to his instructions, to read his books. Yeah. Okay. Something
Thank you,
else?
Prabhuji.
One thing I would like to encourage you also, all of you, is when you do online classes, is try all to chant the sloka. Prabhupada wanted us, everyone, to learn this. He said we should get all these slokas. He wanted devotees to learn all the slokas in the Bhagavatam. Of course, that's quite an ambitious achievement, but at least we should try to learn these slokas as best we can. And that's why you listen to when Prabhupada would give classes, then you see that he would have devotees chant the sloka many times, sometimes 10, 15 times, because he wanted devotees to learn the slokas. And one of the easiest ways of learning the slokas is to hear and to repeat. So I encourage you to try and chant the slokas more. Sudama Mataji?
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji, Dandat Pranam. Thank you so much for the wonderful lecture, Prabhuji. My question is, you narrated, of course, the story of Jada Bharat. He was just one short of Prema stage. He was in the Bhava stage. And because of his attachment, he fell down. But we, like practicing sadhakas, like we are like in the material world, but in the space where we are working or we are going out, but we are still trying to practice and doing our sadhana. We are nowhere near, like long way to go. But unless we are at the prema stage, we can't reach Krishna. So how, like does it mean like it's very hard for us? I know they say like it's not like that. You do have a chance of reaching Krishna in one birth, but with what we all are going through, like so much of anarthas in us, what is the best practice? How to be detached? Like that's the only thing which we need to have attraction for Krishna. So how can that be achieved?
An interesting analogy you could give is just like if you have a cup, and you pour milk in it, and you half fill the cup. When you pour ink in, it'll mix. But if you fill the cup to the point of brimming over, like they have this thing called a meniscus, where how the milk goes up the side of the cup. You know what I mean? Where the liquid will go up the side of the cup like that. But then when you fill it right up, the meniscus is what they call a reverse meniscus, and actually the liquid is above the top of the cup, which is quite interesting. So what happens there, like because I did a math science degree at school years ago, and they explained it to us. What happens is because of where the liquid interacts with the air, there's surface tension created. And Einstein pointed this out. He was showing it with sand and things like that, how the surface tension is created. And this tension of the surface, it holds the liquid together so that even if it's brimming over, it won't spill outside the cup because of the surface tension. So if you carefully pour ink on top of that, the ink will flow off. It won't mix with the milk. So Prabhupada uses this as an analogy to explain that if we are brimming over with Krishna consciousness, then the influence of the material nature cannot touch us. But if we become inattentive, like we see with Bharat Maharaj, he became a little inattentive. He became inattentive. He became more concerned with the deer. I mean, naturally, he should have taken, he should take care of the deer. And you see living in distress, you should be compassionate. That's the nature of the Vaishnava. Vaishnava is compassionate, but not foolish. We have to be compassionate upon other living entities, but don't give up our Krishna consciousness. Don't give up this opportunity to serve Krishna. And it often happens like that. Is there can be some minor inattention, and it doesn't seem like much, but then down the track, a few years down the track, you completely drifted from Krishna consciousness. And Prabhupada sometimes would give the analogy of the railway track. As long as the railway tracks are parallel, the train plies smoothly. But if one of those tracks has got a slight deviation on it, it can only be like a micron. A micron is like a thousandth of an inch, but it could only be a micron. But if it continues on that deviation, eventually it'll come to the point of derailment. So it's the same with us. We need to be, regularly, daily checking ourselves to see how am I applying myself to this process of Krishna consciousness, and not just that externally, like somewhat of a clinical approach. It's definitely important to do that, but also we also need to be really focused on how everything I have is by the mercy of Krishna. Cultivate this. Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj would call it. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Bhakti Tirtha Maharaj. My wife and I were talking about him last night. Very, very great Vaishnava in our line. He was a disciple of Prabhupada. He left his body maybe about 15 years ago, I think, now. And he would talk about this attitude of gratitude and how always to be reflecting how that, by Krishna's mercy, that everything is going on. By Krishna's mercy, I have so much. By Krishna's mercy, he's protecting me from, the influence of the motives of material nature. And whenever we find some weakness, we're experiencing some weakness, pray to Krishna. Please, my dear Lord, protect me from this. Don't think you can fight it on your own, because you can't. Matina Krishna Paratosvatova Mitobi Griha Pratana Madantago Vishatam to Misham Puna Punas Chavita. It's not, but not by Paratosvatova, not by our own endeavor, by the endeavor of others, or by a combination of both can we overcome this material world. It's only by the mercy of Krishna. Of course, we have to endeavor, we have to struggle with this, but always take shelter of Krishna. That is the only hope. If you take shelter of anything else, you're lost. And this is what's happening in materialistic living entities. As Prahlad Maharaj points out, they're taking shelter of these fallible soldiers. And because of this taking shelter of the fallible soldiers, they're lost. Because it's just like a man who's tied hand and feet cannot untie somebody else. So take shelter of the liberated souls, take shelter of Krishna, and then you'll be saved. Yeah? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Okay. Anything
Hare
else?
Krishna. Anyone else has any questions or comments?
Thank you all for your wonderful time, and very nice to be here in Wellington again.